At ease. Pull up a chair and keep quiet. You want to know about the desert? You want to know about the sand? Let me tell you something, son. The desert doesn't just kill you with heat. It swallows you whole. It erases you. The year was 1991, Operation Desert Storm. The whole world was watching the smart bombs on CNN, watching the video game war. But out where we were, deep in the western sector of the Iraqi desert, there weren't any cameras. There was just us, the endless dunes, and a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against your eardrums. My squad, Bravo 2, was tasked with a recon sweep way off the main supply routes. Intel said there was a suspected Republican Guard command bunker buried out there. A ghost target. We were miles from friendly lines, driving Humvees that felt like tin cans in a vast oven. The first thing you noticed wasn't the heat, it was the smell. Saddam had torched the oil fields in Kuwait, and the wind carried that smoke hundreds of miles. The sky wasn't blue. It was a bruised, sickly purple, streaked with black soot. It smelled like sulfur and burning tar. It coated the inside of your nose, tasted like oil on the back of your throat. Then, the shamal hit. It didn't come on slow. It was a wall of earth, a tidal wave of grit rising 3,000 feet into the air. 1 minute we had visibility. The next, the world was gone. The sun was blotted out. Day turned to a suffocating twilight. The wind screamed like a jet engine, stripping the paint off our vehicles. We lost our bearings immediately. The primitive GPS units we had back then couldn't get a lock through the interference. Radio comms were dead static. We were driving blind in a swirling vortex of brown glass. We had to dig in or die. By sheer luck, or maybe something worse, Corporal Rodriguez spotted shapes looming in the haze. Not a modern bunker, not concrete. These were ruins. Broken pillars, jagged walls of stone that looked older than the Bible, half buried in the shifting sands. We drove the Humvees into the lee of a crumbling wall, seeking shelter from the wind that felt like it was trying to sandblast the skin off our bones. We dismounted, coughing, spitting black phlegm, and huddled in the ruins. But as the wind howled outside, inside those walls, it was quiet. Too quiet. And that's when the feeling hit me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, stiff as wire. We weren't just taking shelter. We had walked right into a trap. That's how it started. We were blind, cut off, and sitting on top of something that should have stayed buried. We established a perimeter inside what looked like an old courtyard. The walls were high enough to break the wind, but the sand got everywhere. It was in our boots, our teeth, our actions. We tried to wait it out, but that silence I mentioned, it started to change. First, it was the geometry of the place. I've seen Babylon, I've seen Ur. This wasn't that. The stones were black, slick like obsidian, and covered in carvings that made your eyes water if you looked at them too long. Spirals, jagged teeth. Not a single straight line in the whole damn place. Sergeant O'Neill, my point man, found a campsite in the corner of the ruins. Bedouin, maybe. A small fire pit, a copper kettle, and a rug. The kettle was still warm. The fire had been smothered recently. But there were no footprints leaving the camp, no tracks, just the rug, the kettle, and undisturbed sand. It was a Bedouin ghost town. It was like they had been plucked straight up into the sky. That's when the men started getting twitchy. Rodriguez, our RTO, was fighting with the radio, trying to punch through the interference. He kept looking over his shoulder. "Major," he whispered, eyes wide, looking at the dark opening of a collapsed archway. "Did you call me?" I looked at him. "Negative, Corporal. Keep your ears on the net." He swallowed hard. "Sir, I heard you, plain as day. You whispered my name, Rodriguez. Came from right over there." He pointed into the swirling dust outside our shelter. I told him to stow it, told him it was the wind playing tricks. But 5 minutes later, Ramirez, a tough kid from the Bronx who didn't scare easy, racked the slide on his M16. He was staring at a dune that had piled up against the eastern wall. "Movement," Ramirez hissed. "I saw a hand. Someone's buried in there." We moved in, weapons raised. We dug into that dune. There was nothing there but sand. But as we dug, the sand didn't slide down naturally. It felt heavy, wet. It clumped together like it was holding on. And the smell changed. The burning oil scent was gone. Now it smelled like copper, like old, dried blood. The wind outside dropped for a split second, just a breath. And in that gap, we all heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. My voice. "Help me. Help me." It sounded exactly like me, but it was coming from deep under the sand we were standing on. The men looked at me, then at the ground. We realized then that the desert wasn't empty, and it was hungry. You ever try to shoot a shadow? You ever try to put a bullet in a nightmare? We backed away from that dune, weapons locked tight. The ground beneath our boots felt spongy, unstable. The voice mimicking me stopped. Silence returned for a heartbeat. Then the sand around us began to vibrate. Not from the wind. It was a low-frequency hum, rattling our teeth. Rodriguez, the RTO, suddenly ripped his headset off. He was weeping, sobbing. "My mom," he stammered. "Major, that's my mom. She's calling me." "Rodriguez, stand down!" I roared. "That is not your mother!" But the desert knows your weakness. It knows what you left back home. From the darkness of the ruins, a voice floated out, sweet, confused, and terrified. "David? David, it's dark. Please." Rodriguez broke formation. He took 2 steps toward the shadows. "Don't!" Ramirez screamed, lunging to grab him. That was the mistake. The moment Ramirez stepped off the stone pavers and onto the open sand, the trap sprung. The dune didn't slide. It erupted. It wasn't a sinkhole. It was a mouth. The sand liquefied instantly. Ramirez let out a sound I've never heard a human make. A wet, gurgling shriek. He didn't sink. He was yanked. Something had him by the ankles. He opened fire. Crack, crack, crack. The muzzle flashes of his M16 lit up the swirling dust like strobe lights. For a split second, I saw it. Just a glimpse. It wasn't a hand. It was a tendril of fused sand and glass, like a whip, wrapped tight around his leg. It looked like the desert itself had grown muscles. "Major, help me!" Ramirez screamed. His voice was raw terror. We rushed forward, O'Neill and I grabbing his flak vest. We pulled. God help us, we pulled until I thought we'd rip him in half. But the strength of that thing, it was hydraulic. It was the weight of the earth. Ramirez looked me right in the eye, his face white with shock. Then, with a violent jerk, he was gone. He was pulled straight down into the earth. The sand swirled over the spot where he had been standing, smoothing itself out instantly. No hole, no tunnel, just smooth, pristine ripples. Then, from beneath our feet, muffled by 6 feet of dirt, we heard it. "Major, help me!" And then, a second later, the exact same voice, same pitch, same terror, echoed from the radio handset Rodriguez had dropped. "Major, help me!" The thing wasn't just killing him. It was recording him. We stood there, weapons pointed at the ground, realizing that our enemy was the very thing we were standing on. And Ramirez, he was still screaming down there. Panic is a contagion, and Rodriguez was patient zero. He was screaming at the radio, screaming at the ground. The voices coming out of the sand weren't just Ramirez anymore. It was a chorus. 1,000 different people, men, women, children, all crying out in the dark language of the desert. And underneath it all, that wet, grinding sound of shifting earth. "They're everywhere, Major! They're under the tires!" Rodriguez yelled. I looked at the Humvee. It wasn't just sinking. It was being digested. The metal was groaning as the sand pressed in, crushing the chassis like a soda can. "Get to the high ground," I ordered, grabbing Rodriguez by the collar. "Get to the pillars!" We scrambled up the slick black stones of the ruin's central altar. It was the only thing solid in a sea of fluid earth. O'Neill made it. I made it. Rodriguez slipped. He didn't even scream. He just vanished into the floor, sucked down in a blink. Then the sand stopped moving. The wind died instantly. The silence was worse than the noise. From the center of the courtyard, where Ramirez and Rodriguez had disappeared, the sand began to rise. It didn't pour. It flowed upward, defying gravity. It coalesced into a shape, a towering, shifting pillar of silica and dust, 20 feet high. And then it opened its eyes. They weren't eyes. They were hollow sockets of absolute darkness. The face formed, crude, shifting, like a child's clay sculpture, and it took the shape of Rodriguez, then Ramirez, then me. It leaned down, looming over us on the altar. The smell was overpowering, ozone and rotting meat. It opened a mouth that was just a jagged rip in the sand, and it spoke. Not with one voice, but with the stolen voices of my men, layered on top of each other in a sickening harmony. "Join us, Karl. It is cold above. It is warm below." I stared into that abyss. I felt the vibration of it in my fillings. This wasn't an animal. It was a geological cancer. It was a sentient part of the earth that had been feeding on travelers since Babylon. I had one card left to play. "O'Neill! Eyes!" I roared. I pulled the pin on a Willie Pete, a white phosphorus grenade. I didn't throw it at the thing. I threw it at the base of the pillar, right into the mass of shifting sand that held it up. Flash. The heat was instantaneous. 5,000 degrees. White phosphorus doesn't just burn, it consumes. It turned the sand to glass in a heartbeat. The creature didn't scream, it shattered. The intense heat crystallized the base of the entity, turning the fluid sand into brittle, jagged fulgurite. The towering form collapsed, screaming with the sound of 1,000 panes of glass breaking at once. The shock wave knocked us flat against the ancient stones. For a moment, the desert burned white hot. We thought we'd killed it. But you can't kill the desert, son. You can only hurt it enough to make it spit you out. We didn't look back. We scrambled over the glass wreckage of the creature, our boots crunching on the fused silica. We ran until our lungs burned, until the muscles in our legs seized up. We ran until the ruins were just a dark smudge on the horizon. We walked for 14 hours. No water, no radio. Just the sun hammering down on us, trying to finish what the night had started. A supply convoy found us near the Kuwaiti border. O'Neill was speaking gibberish. I was dehydrated, holding onto my weapon so tight they had to pry it from my fingers. Then came the suits. We were separated immediately, flown to Ramstein, then back to the States. I spent 3 weeks in a debriefing room with men who wore clean uniforms and didn't have sand under their fingernails. I told them everything. The ruins, the voices, the thing that ate Ramirez and Rodriguez. They nodded. They took notes. And then they handed me a piece of paper. Combat fatigue, they called it. Acute dehydration and heat-induced hallucinations. They told me Ramirez and Rodriguez stepped on an unexploded mine. There were no bodies to recover. Closed casket. The families got a folded flag and a lie. I got a medical discharge and a warning. Keep your mouth shut, Major, or you lose your pension. But here's the thing about the desert. It never really lets you go. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I turn on the radio. Just the static. And if I tune it just right, between the stations, I can hear them. I can hear Rodriguez crying for his mother. I can hear Ramirez screaming. And I can hear that other voice, the one that sounds like me, whispering from the static. It is warm below, Karl. Come back. I look at the playground sandbox down the street, or the grid on my windshield, and I wonder, is it just sand? Or is it a dormant cell of something that's waiting for us to step off the pavement? Be careful where you dig, soldiers. Some things are buried for a reason. Major Karl, signing off. If you want to survive the next briefing, you need to stay informed. Click that subscribe button, ring the bell. Leave a comment below if you've ever heard something in the wild that didn't belong there.